It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor Fiona Steele from the London School of Economics. Fiona's research interests are in the development of statistical methods that are motivated by social sciences problems, I'm told on a good authority. Her areas of expertise include longitudinal data analysis, multilevel, and latent variable modeling, and models for complex covariance structures. And she has worked on a range of applications in demography, education, family, psychology, and health. Fiona has received a number of accolades, including a fellowship of the British Academy in 2009. And she's directed the Learning Center for Multilevel Methodology and Application, or otherwise LEMA, where she led the development of a popular online training course, which currently attracts over 30,000 registered users worldwide. Recently, she's been working on the interrelationships between housing transitions and fertility in Britain and Australia, and on methods for the analysis of longitudinal dyadic data with application in intergenerational exchanges for support in Britain. So without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Fiona to tell you a little bit more about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mona, for that kind introduction. And as this is the very last talk of the conference, I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the organisers for really what's been a fantastic event. So my talk today stems from a long-standing interest in multi-level models for complex covariant structures that arise in the social sciences. That's my area of interest, but going beyond that as well. And these structures might include longitudinal data, multivariate data, and other forms of clustering. And these kinds of structures often arise in the same data set. And so the question is, how do we specify realistic models to represent these structures, and also derive interpretable parameters from these models and the interpretation. Now, I've been fortunate to work with many social scientists over my career, and the work I'm going to present today draws on those collaborations. They include demographers, psychologists, and very recently anthropologists, and also working in teams of statisticians, and in particular computational statisticians who have the expertise to make these models feasible to implement. More specifically, although I'm going to include a review of this area, I'm going to be drawing on two specific examples from my recent research from a grant that ended a couple of years ago. And a bit of rearrangement of the title there gives DLANY, which stands for Dynamic Longitudinal Analysis of Intergenerational Exchanges. And I'd just like to acknowledge the contributions there of all my co-investigators. It's quite a multidisciplinary team of statisticians and social scientists. So let me start just by saying a little bit about dyadic data. First of all, what are they, and why might we be interested in them? Well, as the name suggests, these are data on pairs of units. Those units could be individuals, and that's going to be my focus in the examples, but they could be countries, organizations, and so on. And I'm going to look at the situation where we have a response on each member of the dyad. It could be more than one response, because there are situations where you have only one response per dyad. I'm not going to be focusing on that simpler situation. So why are they collected? Well, they can be used to answer a number of questions concerning interrelationships between the individuals that make up the dyad. So, for example, we might be interested in ties between the members of the dyad, which might be reported from the perspective of both members of the dyad, and the impact of characteristics of one person in the dyad and the other member. And also of interest is the association between the two outcomes, which is often termed reciprocity or concordance, depending on the particular application. So where do dyadic data come from? Well, actually, once you start looking, you find them everywhere. You find them from experiments. So there's a nice example thinking of speed dating, where individuals are paired with a number of other individuals, and then afterwards they might be asked to rate their partners on a number of different attributes. There are also experiments which actually involve observing dyads interacting together, and I'm going to be talking about an example of that towards the end of my talk. Surveys, particularly household surveys, provide dyadic data, and particularly on families. These are the household surveys. And child cohort studies, many of them provide information on friendship networks for children in the same class. It's also possible, though, to derive dyadic data from secondary sources. So quite a lot of work in international relations, looking at relationships between pairs of countries, and in research co-authorship networks. Okay? So they're just a few focusing on the social sciences. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of features that we want to take into account in the analysis of dyadic data. There are many more, but I want to focus on two of those. The first concerns whether the individuals within the dyad have distinguishable roles. In other words, is there some characteristic that can be used to distinguish the two individuals? So, for example, in heterosexual couples, you might distinguish between the wife and the husband. In the families, parent, child, siblings, and so on, and in the organizational setting, the relative seniority of the two individuals. In other situations, the two members of the dyad may be exchangeable or indistinguishable, so friendship networks or classmates, children in the same school. Another feature that we want to think about when we're thinking about how to analyze dyadic data, and this is probably the most fundamental one, is how many dyads does a person belong to? Is it one or more than one? That's essentially it. So at the top there, I've got an example of single partner dyads. We've got two famous couples there. And the point there is that each of the four individuals is only a member of one dyad, at least at a given point in time. In the second scenario, here we have a family setting, and we've got four individuals, so mother, father, and two children. And in this situation, each person in the family is partnered with the other three. So they're a member then of three dyads. So this is really a fundamental distinction, and I'm going to structure the rest of my talk around this. So I'll start off with the much simpler single partner case and define some terms that I'll be using throughout the talk: actor, partner, and reciprocity. And I'll talk about some extensions that can be accommodated using multi-level models. I'll then go on to talk about my first example, looking at bidirectional exchanges of support between parents and their adult children. Then I'll move on to the multiple partner case. These kinds of data are often collected using a design called a round-robin design. And a common way of analysing such data is using what's called a social relations model. So I'll talk about that, and then again some extensions focusing on those that can be answered using multi-level models. Then a second example, also from a family situation, and then round up with some related work and some a quick summary. All right, and both of those examples actually now are shortly to appear in the Society's Journal Series A. Okay. That was very fortuitous. They hadn't been accepted by the time I agreed to give this talk, so it's quite nice that they're appearing in RSS journals. Okay, so let me start with the single partner case. So just to introduce a little bit of notation, and I'm not going to give technical details here, methods of estimation. I just want to give you a flavour of the models and their interpretation. So here we have a dyad and two responses measured on two different individuals. Okay? So we have these labels, actor and partner, depending on who the response is measured on. So if the response is measured on person one is called the actor and two the partner, and those roles are then reversed for the second response, Y2. And suppose also that we have a single covariate which is measured on both individuals in the dyad. So there are many examples of this kind of data in the literature, particularly looking at couples and other family pairings, for example, parent-child. Okay, so an example there, you might have parent and child reporting, giving an assessment of the quality of their relationship. And the point there is that both the partner, the parent and the child can give reports of that, and we're interested in how closely associated they are. So start off with an approach that might be used to analyse these data, and we're dealing here with a cross-sectional case to start with. Essentially what this is a bivariate response model. But in psychology, where this approach originated for analysing dyadic data, it's been called the actor-partner interdependence model. Okay. In psychology, every model has a specific name. I've been told that this is so that then that can be associated with you as the originator. But a statistician looking at that thinks, well, it's a bivariate response model. And it is indeed, but there's a particular feature about it that I want to draw out. And that is that we're defining a linear model here for the two people's responses, but we're including as predictors both of their X values. And that their coefficients are referred to as actor and partner effects. So the effect of one's own X value on their response is referred to an actor effect. Those are the ones in blue and represented in the path diagram on the right by the vertical lines, the paths. And then we have the effect of the other person's X value, and we refer to that as the partner effect. And we complete the specification by allowing for an association between the two responses, and that is a measure of reciprocity or concordance in the two responses. Now, another way of analysing these data would be to include a dyad level random effect, but we have to think carefully about whether that's appropriate, because that would be implying that we have a positive reciprocity, which might not always be the case. Okay? One theme I want to bring out is it's very important to look at the implied covariance structure when you start bringing in a more complex multi-level models. Does it make sense? Oh, and just to say that this model would be suitable if you had distinguishable dyads. If they're indistinguishable, then you would have some quality constraints on the two actor effects and the two partner effects. They're quite straightforward to move between the two. Now, there have been a number of extensions to this kind of models, and particularly for longitudinal data. Longitudinal dyadic data are increasingly collected, and these are often analysed using something called a cross-lagged panel model. That looks very like the model that I showed you just one moment ago. Let's go back to it. But we just replace these two X's by the lags of two responses. Okay, so it's a first-order Markov model. And so what we're saying then is that a person's response at time t is influenced by their own response at t and also that of their partners. All right. Closely related to that is something called a dynamic structure equation model, and that is used when you have intensive longitudinal data, so very high frequency with short intervals between the observation. That gives you much more information and to be able to estimate some additional parameters, and I'll come back to that a bit later. Also, if in a longitudinal case, the process of interest might be one that's dependent on age, and then there's interest in looking at individual trajectories and then looking at the correlation between those trajectories over time. So, for example, two partners, we might be interested in how changes in their cognitive or physical function as they age are associated. Other extensions, other forms of clustering, I'll talk about family effects later, and also multivariate data. So typically in social sciences, the constructs that we're interested in are multidimensional and or need to be measured by multiple indicators, which we can then define as latent variables. So that brings me on to my first example. Looking at parent-child exchanges of support, intergenerational exchanges. And this is joint work with Siliang Zhang, another statistician, particularly in latent variable modeling and computational statistics, and two social scientists, Emily Grundy, who is a real authority on aging, and Tanya Burchard, who works in social policy. So let me start by saying a little bit about the data. So it's longitudinal. It's collected in the sort of major UK household panel survey, also known as Understanding Society. So we've got up to 4 measurements per person, 2 years in interval. Now, these data I would call pseudo-dyadic, and it's quite common in these kinds of surveys that the data is collected only from one person in the dyad. So I'm going to be looking at the parental reports of exchanges of help with their adult children, that is both giving and receiving help. Also, another limitation is that they're reporting on children collectively. The questions weren't asked about each of their children. Nevertheless, the data have a dyadic structure, so we can apply dyadic models. And we distinguish between practical and financial help. So this forms 4 binary responses when you consider giving and receiving these 2 types of help. So in terms of the research questions, well, there's 2 main types. The first one really concerns your sort of traditional covariate effects. And what are the characteristics associated with giving and receiving help? These might be associated with a person's capacity to give help and their need for help. But I want to focus on the second question, which is really the correlations among the 4 responses. And there are 2 types here. There are correlations between giving and receiving help, which is a measure of reciprocity. But there is also correlations between financial and practical help. And that's of interest because it's often thought that practical and financial help might act as substitutes for one another, particularly if you've got parents and children who are living far apart, then perhaps children are not able to give practical help, but they maybe substitute that with financial help. So that's a question of interest. Another theme I want to bring out is that this covariance structure that we're studying is not just something to be accounted for a nuisance, right? It's something that's of substantive interest in its own right. So the data has this sort of multi-level structure then. So we've got 2 dyads per family. In most cases, it will be the mother and father. And generally speaking, they will be reporting on the same children. By the way, these are children who are living outside of the home. But not necessarily because, you know, the 2 partners maybe actually, they may be referring to different children. But nevertheless, we would expect high correlations between those responses. The data are longitudinal, as I mentioned, and also multivariate. So we want to take into account this sort of structure in our model. So the data has this structure here, which I illustrate with this diagram. So think about within a family, we have up to 2 dyads. There could just be 1, mother and father. We have each one observed for up to 4 time points. And then at each time point, we have these 4 responses that are measuring the type of exchange. But the data are highly unbalanced. And so any method you use to analyze these data needs to be able to cope with that. So the covariance structure, well, first of all, we model these data in terms of an underlying latent variable, as is common when you think of a binary response. So actually what we're fitting is like a probit model. And I want to distinguish between 3 types of covariance here. So you've got covariances between different responses at a given point in time and for a given dyad. You've got temporal covariances, so for a given response between 2 time points. And then finally, the correlation between the 2 dyads, so the mother and father reports. So we have a 32 by 32 covariance matrix here for each family, but the dimension varies across families. Now, many of you here will think, well, that's pretty trivial. You wouldn't think of that as being high dimensional these days. But for these kinds of models, it is. So there's computational issues with sort of estimating a covariance matrix of that size, but also interpretation, right? So what we want to do is impose this structure on the covariance matrix in line with these 3 different types, and we do that with a combination of random effects and allowing for correlations between residuals. So here we have this linear model for the exchanges between parents and children. And if you ignored, if you ignored this W term, what you would have is a 3-level hierarchical model with a multivariate response. Okay, where you've got time within individuals, the dyads within the family. Okay. But it turns out that structure gives a too restrictive covariance structure. And if we add in an extra effect, this family effect, time-varying family effect, that allows much more flexibility. The problem is that the 3-level structure assumes that correlations over time are higher than correlations, say, between the mother and father, which is not actually the case in our data. So very important to look at the implied covariance structure, otherwise you can end up with, say, binary solutions or just nonsensical results. So I just want to talk through some very a small selection of results. You can imagine this is quite a complex model, a lot of parameters to interpret and make sense of. So a bit of descriptive information there about the analysis sample. But I'm going to focus on the correlation estimates, which, as mentioned, were of interest in their own right. So we've got the temporal correlation, the between wave, which ranges from 0.44 to 0.49, depending on which of those 4 exchanges you're looking at, giving, receiving, or financial and practical help. Then we've got the correlation between the dyads, that's between the mother and father, and that's somewhat higher, all right? So you might expect that because by and large, these partners, which I've called mother and father, they will be reporting on the same children. And to a large extent, help given to the children will be joint for the partners, and also help received is often joint. So that's why you have this high correlation, which causes the problem if you just fit this standard 3-level model. Then moving on to the cross-outcome correlations, which are of more interest. The first 2 are between giving and receiving help. So these relate to reciprocity or symmetry of help. So, for example, the first one, 0.42, that tells us that parents who give practical help also tend to receive practical help from their children. The last correlation there is looking at this substitution question about financial and practical help. And that's quite high, and it is positive, right? So that suggests that it isn't a substitution effect, which would give us a negative correlation. The 2 are given together or received together. So we think of them as then being complementary. I'll now move on to this more complex case where an individual can be a member of multiple dyads. In other words, they can have multiple partners. And many examples of this in the literature. Here are just a few. So I mentioned already international relations, and there, so you've got pairs of countries, and each country can be paired with every other country. Speed dating was another example. Again, people being paired with multiple partners and assessing each one. Now, there's a number of kinds of research questions that can be asked of these kinds of data. And the analysis approach would depend, obviously not only on the data structure, but on the questions that you're interested in. And when individuals are members of multiple dyads, then the data have a social network structure, okay, which many of you will be familiar with. It's a huge area of research and a very active one. But the aims of traditional social network analysis, well, there are many of them, but they might include identifying clusters of individuals who, within which you have higher than average probabilities of ties. Often it's interesting in looking at ties between individuals. And also looking at the processes that have generated the network and trying to parameterize those in terms of a model to see how consistent a model is with the observed network. My focus is rather different, and I'm very much focused on the individual outcomes for each person in the dyad, and interested in actor, partner, and dyad effects, which I'll talk about in a moment. And they could be effects of specific covariates that are measured on the actor, the partner, and the dyad, or they could be unmeasured influences that are related to these sort of three sources of variation. And then we might be interested in looking at the relative contributions of these different sources of correlation, of variance, sorry. And then again, looking at reciprocity. So these kinds of data often arise from a round-robin design. And in the simplest case, each individual in a sample is paired with every other individual in the sample. But in variants of that, you might have a clustered or a block design where the pairings are formed within clusters. So just to illustrate here, I've got 3 individuals, A, B, and C, who are forming a cluster, and each individual is paired with the other 2, leading to being member of 2 dyads. And the responses that we measure on these individuals can be undirected, which effectively gives you a dyad level response or a symmetric response. So in other words, if we were looking at the behavior of one person towards the other, that would be saying that the behavior of A to B is the same as the behavior of B towards A, which is generally not going to be the case. Okay? So I'm going to focus on the directed situation, which is why we have these double-headed paths between the individuals, and that leads to 6 directed responses. And these kinds of data are commonly analysed using some form of what's called the social relations model. And this goes back to work in 1979 involving David Kenny, who's a psychologist who's one of the sort of authorities on dyadic data analysis, and it's been further developed since then by him and a number of colleagues. So the basic model takes this form here. So we're looking, remember, at so y is ij is relating to the say the behaviour of I towards j. So here we can distinguish between the actor effect, which is relating to individual I, the partner effect, which is relating to individual J, and then a relationship or a dyad effect, which is relating to the dyad as a combination. Okay. And traditionally, or the early days, this model was formulated as an analysis of variance model. So the A and the P were treated as fixed effects. But these days, it is really formulated as a random effects model. And a major reason for that is it's much more flexible. So it can handle unbalanced data very straightforwardly and a number of different extensions, which I'm going to talk through briefly. So we're interested in the variances of each of these effects and also some covariances. And these covariances have interpretations as types of reciprocity. Okay. And so incidentally, we can only visualize these or conceive of these as random effects, these actor and partner effects, because of observing individuals with multiple partners and with multiple actors. In the previous case, each person only had one actor and one partner, so you weren't able to do this. You could only estimate the effects of a specific variable, which we referred to as an actual partner effect. Okay, so just to go through the interpretation, let's suppose then that Yij is the amount of help given from I to j. So we've got the actor effect, which is just the general tendency of individual I to give help to anybody that they're paired with, not only j. Pj, the partner effect, the tendency for person j to elicit help from anybody. And the correlation between these two effects for the same individual is referred to as generalized reciprocity. So in other words, just to what extent do people who have a high tendency to give help to others also have a high tendency to receive help in return? Okay. And then we have the residual, which is also termed as this relationship or dyad effect, and the dyadic reciprocity. That refers to the residual correlation between the help given by I to j and the help given by j to I. Okay? But this is the reciprocity after controlling for the actor and partner tendencies. Right. So just to illustrate the sort of structure of this model, let's go back to our example of the three individuals A, B, and C. So we've got these 6 directed responses in the middle, and each one has an influence from the actor and also the partner. Now, the key thing here, when you were thinking about multi-level structure, is that the actor and the partner classifications are not nested. Well, they're involving the same individuals, right? And in work with Tom Schneider's, Kenny recognized this as an example of a cross-classified multi-level model. And at the time that they discovered this, 1999, it was extremely awkward to fit these models in software. You had to have lots of different constraints on variances to be able to fit them. But with the advent of MCMC methods, these have now become much more straightforward, and particularly work by one of my former colleagues here, Bill Brown, using MCMC for these kinds of models. And MCMC estimation has now facilitated a number of generalizations of these models. Well, the first two are fairly trivial, allowing for role-specific parameters if the dyads are distinguishable, adding covariates. But we can add in other levels of clustering. We can now handle any type of response. There are generalized linear models, extensions of these. For longitudinal data, there have been growth curve models. So this is where you've got these processes depending on age. And where you have multivariate data, there have been latent variable models. Okay. So now, before I go on to give you an illustration of some of these extensions in my own research, I just want to go back and position the social relations model with a very widely used approach for social network analysis, which is the exponential random graph model. So starting with the social relations model, just a bit of a recap about this. So this is really a model for a bivariate response, so behavior of I to j and of j to I, albeit one with this complex cross-classified structure. The response can be any type. So it could be the presence of a tie between the individuals, or it could be some rating of one individual of the other, or behavior. It could be anything. And the covariates will relate to the two individuals, the actor, the partner, and they could also relate to the dyad as a whole. And there's interest not only in covariate effects of these individual and dyad characteristics, but in partitioning the variance, the unexplained variance between these three sources of variation, and in the reciprocity. Turning to the ERGM, this is really the focus of these models, or the applications, have very often been on whether there are ties between two individuals, which may be reported from the perspective of both. And here it's really a model for the existence of a tie between two particular individuals, conditional on the rest of the network. So I call that Yij complement. So because these responses are usually binary or perhaps a count if there's a measure of the intensity, perhaps, of a tie between two individuals. And the covariates are not so much relating to individuals or the dyad, but to the whole network. So this could be, say, the number of ties or the number of ties that share the same attributes as and INJ. And then these models are really formulated to test hypotheses about the mechanisms that have generated the observed network. So really, I think the fundamental difference is really in the type of questions. Although the same models could be applied to the two models could be applied to the same data in some situations. So let me now give another example of the application of these models. And this is a rather different one. It's involving two other statisticians, Rebecca Pillinger, George Leckie, and a developmental psychologist, Jenny Jenkins. So here we're looking at family round-robin data. So I think of this as multiple mini networks. Rather than having one big network, there's lots of small ones. So here we've got 4 different families, and again, you have this sort of unbalanced design quite often in practice. You've got the mother, father, 2 children, but in some families, the father isn't present, for example, or maybe only one of the children is present. The data come from a Canadian study, and the younger child, who was the main sort of target child in the study, was aged 5 to 9 at the time these data were collected. They were followed from birth. And it's a really interesting data set. The parents and children, each pair within the family, were recorded as they worked together on a task. It's called a conflict discussion. Okay? And this conflict the topic of the conflict was chosen by both people in the dyad from a list. So it could range from a discussion about parenting styles to how you decide what to watch on TV. Okay? So both areas that could be of quite a lot of a conflict. Right? And then the recordings were watched by multiple raters. And the amount of constructiveness that one person showed towards the other was recorded on a 5-point scale, from highly destructive behavior to highly constructive. Actually, none of the pairs were observed to have any highly destructive behavior, which might be surprising when we think of our own families. But remember, this is an experimental setting, so perhaps they were on best behavior. All right. And so this requires an extension to the social relations model that I showed you a moment ago. First of all, we've got the clustering by family. So that introduces another random effect, the family, and the subscript K is indexing the family. Also, having longitudinal data is quite powerful here because it allows us to separate out factors that are specific to the dyad, represented by D here, from time-varying factors, which importantly would include measurement error. Okay? And all of the parameters are specific to the particular role of a person within the family and the combination of roles. Right. And on top of that, we specify a first-order bivariate sort of dynamic structure on these time-varying residuals. And here we have 2 parameters of interest. We have an autoregressive effect. So that would be so we're looking at the residual from a model of I's behavior towards J. That can depend on the residual for J's behavior towards I at the previous time point. So we can think of phi1 as being a measure of the persistence in a person's behavior in a particular dyad. The cross-lag effect is the effect of the other person's behavior towards them at the previous time point. And here we just have a graphical representation of this structure for a particular dyad. And here we're looking at a sibling dyad, the younger child paired with the older one. Okay. So let me just give you a couple of results just to illustrate the interpretation of these models. And there is a lot going on. And we don't actually have any covariates. The interest is entirely in the covariance structure, the variances and the covariances and these autoregressive and cross-lag terms, which can be interpreted as correlations. Okay. So first of all, the first column of numbers are the autoregressive parameters, as I mentioned, measuring persistence. It's also in this context thought to measure like emotional regulation, okay? Sort of how stable are our behaviors from one snapshot to the next. And they're fairly similar for the behavior older towards younger and younger towards older. But in terms of the cross-lag effects, this is only significant for the younger child behavior towards the older. Okay? So there's an impact. So the younger child's behavior is influenced by the older child's behavior towards them in the previous time point. And this is often referred in this literature to sort of tit-for-tat behavior. Okay? It doesn't work the other way around, that the older child is not so influenced by how the younger child behaved towards them in the previous time point. We'll also look at the dyadic reciprocity and the generalized reciprocity, just again focusing on this child dyad, just for illustration. So the dyadic reciprocity, that looks at the correlation between younger behavior towards older and older behavior towards younger. But this is now over the whole task, not just from one moment to the next. Okay? And that's now much, much higher, although not actually significant. Then moving on to the generalized reciprocity. So this is the correlation between a person's behavior towards others and the behavior that they elicit from others. This is now across all family members, not just with this particular other child. And here again, similar order of magnitude of correlation, but the only significant one is among the older children. Okay, so just an illustration again of how the correlation structure is here something of interest, not something to be counted for. So a number of extensions have been considered for these kinds of data. So I've been looking, and I focus first of all on the social relations model. So I've been looking at dyadic behavior. There is some work that extends that to look at triads with sort of third order dependence. In my application, the only interactions were within clusters, within the families, but more generally, you can have interactions across clusters. So there's been work, for example, looking at interactions between households in a village. Some of you may be familiar with stochastic block models, which have been used a lot in social network analysis, particularly to try to identify clusters in the network. So in my examples, the clusters were already kind of defined. You know, the families are clusters, they're not clusters to be discovered. They are naturally occurring. But more generally, we may want to try to identify the clusters. And in that case, this stochastic block model could be combined with a social relations model. And that has been done in some recent work, again, in psychology. Turning back to the case where we have just single-person dyads, there's been some work looking at these intensive longitudinal data. We have many, many more measurements over time than I have had. And by having sort of more information on each individual and each dyad, that allows us to estimate some additional parameters, and in particular, individual-specific parameters, not just role-specific. And then finally, just the work I've been involved in with Siliang Zhang and Yoni Kuha. This is now modeling the reciprocity correlation as a function of covariates. And that is of interest to look at, for example, that substitution question about financial and practical help, because it could be that the correlation between those depends on how far apart the parents and the children are living together, are living apart. Okay? But that has computational challenges because we want to ensure that the correlation matrix is positive definite for every combination of covariates. So let me end with just a summary of the main points. So dyadic data, Yeah, so once you start looking for them, you'll find them in many, many disciplines. And they're really a rich source of information to look at interrelationships. Multilevel models are a very flexible and now computationally feasible way to analyze these kinds of data, particularly when they have more complex structures than the basic cross-sectional case. And again, just want to drive home this point that the covariance structure is not always just something we just want to allow for and forget about. It can be something of intrinsic interest in its own right. Okay, at that point, I will stop for questions.
Thanks a lot, Fiona, for a very interesting talk. And we have a number of questions, so please keep them coming in. And so the first question we had is, have you looked into / collaborated with social media data or public health data?
What was the second one? Public use?
Public health data.
Public health data. The quick answer to that is no, I haven't. And I think in those areas, but I've certainly seen a lot of good applications, certainly in social media. And I think that tends to, though, give more of the traditional kind of social network, where you have maybe one big network and there's interest in looking at clusters. So, for example, use of Twitter. Public health data, no, I haven't seen applications of that other than looking at couples and, say, looking at correlation between different, their health over time, but not kind of public health data, as probably many would interpret that. But yeah, open to collaborations. That sounds very interesting.
Fantastic. So yeah, I think, do you envisage challenges if you want to bring social and public health data together in this context?
It'd be interesting to know what people had in mind. Bringing together social media data and public health data. So I guess there you're linking together two very different forms of data. So I guess there's the usual issues of data linkage. But certainly Bayesian estimation methods are very well suited to analysing so different sources of data like that.
Moving on to the next one, could these methods provide an alternative to methods for reliability of measurements? For example, kappa, bland Altman limits, or the intracluster correlation coefficient.
Okay, so reliability of measurements. In the second example that I presented, so there we have these ratings of the behaviour of one individual towards another, and certainly there'd been a lot of work. Not carried out by me, but by the psychologists on the team, looking at inter-rater reliability there. And obviously for a psychologist, that is absolutely essential. And it would be interesting, I didn't have the data on that, but to incorporate that in a multi-level model. So you could think of then having at each time point the two different ratings, or more than two if you have more than two raters. And then, yes, exactly, you could then estimate the intra-rater agreement as part of the multi-level model.
Thank you. And on the reciprocity cases, is there any evidence for bimodal distributions?
Bimodal for reciprocity? Yes, that's a very good question. I mean, there's certainly... Now, in other work on these data, looking at, the first example, where we're looking at the parent-child exchanges of support, in other work, we've actually treated that as a multivariate response, because I've boiled it down to practical and financial help, but there are actually 8 different types of help that have been collapsed in this way. And in other work, we have used multivariate models to look at that. And if you do that, you do find that there's sort of a bimodal distribution, because you've got some individuals who never give any help or never receive any help, and that could be because no help is needed on either side. And the way we've handled that would be to fit a kind of a mixture model, because essentially what you've got then is a zero inflation problem. So again, that can be incorporated within the multi-level model, along together with having these continuous random effects or latent variables.
And can you say more about the computationally complexity of fitting these models in comparison to other possible approaches for this data?
Okay, computational issues. Well, now the first example I gave you, that did require algorithms to be developed specifically for this case. Because although I only had 4 multivariate responses, actually maximum likelihood methods, when you've got some complex random effects structure on top, at least in readily available software, really grind to a halt when you've got a relatively large data set. And the same would be true if you were using, the off-the-shelf MCMC packages. So this did really require a more efficient algorithm to be tailored, and I'm fortunate to work with my computational statistician, Silian Zhang, who was able to implement that. The other case, much smaller data set, able to use existing multi-level MCMC software, so we use dyads in this case. But I think the real issue with that case is that we're estimating a lot of parameters, and you do have a lot of convergence issues. And it's so important to have, very long burn-ins. In our case, for some parameters, we required a burn-in of about 200,000, and running for with very large chain lengths. Also, making sure to use multiple chains and all the other approaches that we would use for MCMC estimation. So you have to be very careful, certainly, about convergence for these problems.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions about application of the techniques. And one is asking about, have it been applied on public, international, and country relationships? And specifically, they were thinking first world countries influencing third world countries. You might disagree with the classification, but you probably have idea what they're about. And then about dating apps as well.
Dating
data.
apps, yeah. The international relations, for example, looking at influences of one country on another, or there has been work looking at disputes between countries, and I guess the same sort of approach could be used to look at collaboration between countries or influences of one and another. I did give a reference to that. What I'll do, I meant to say, is that I do have slides, all the references, and what I'll do is I'll put them on my website. So you can look at follow up on some of the applications that I've mentioned there. Sorry, Mona, could you remind me of the second example? Dating apps. Yes. No, I'm not familiar of any applications of that. So that would be a very interesting one. The example of speed dating, that comes from a more kind of experimental setup, but. Yes, I mean these approaches could be used for data for information on app. I'm not familiar with the app, so do you have information on, say, ratings of individuals of others? What would be the outcome? So that would be the question.
It'd be good to ask the person who asked. On the same note, we had as well asking about studies on animals and interactions, basically, with animals.
With animals, okay. So in veterinary applications, I'm not aware of any. I don't know if Bill is here. He works in veterinary sciences. No, okay. I'm not aware of any, I have to say. I have focused really on applications in the social sciences. But yeah, I'd imagine in the veterinary sciences there would be experiments where you've got pairs, you're looking at pairs of animals and how they interact together.
Fantastic. Thank you. And could the framework be used in communicable epidemiology such as COVID-19 spreading?
COVID-19 spreading. I guess, I mean, you could think of if you had information on ties between individuals, so contact between individuals. You could think of that as a social network. And then that could be analysed using these kinds of methods. But in terms of individuals being partnered with multiple other individuals, I think you would have to collect that data, finding out, for example, who people's friends are and the kind of contact that they have with them. So if you have the data, then yes, I think these methods could be quite revealing. Yeah.
Your examples seem to be about building knowledge. How these methods were they used to inform policy?
It's a very good question, and I think this is the beauty of working with social scientists who have the expertise in the subject area. The second example I gave, so that was working with somebody who's from social policy, Tanya Burchard. And we did write a paper that really tried to bring together results from the whole project and focusing on the interpretation and what the policy messages were. That was circulated to a number of policymakers, people in government. There was a little interest in follow-up from charity sector, but not so much from the government. I guess they've had other things to focus on since we finished our work. Not a good time, I think, to have influence on social policy, but certainly, I think it's very difficult, particularly when research hasn't been commissioned by government. We're trying to interest government in research that we've done, and I think there's a lot of luck involved in that. Thank you.
How robust, brackets meaningful, are estimates for non-normal data / residuals?
Okay. So non-normal data, always a question with random effects models. I'm not talking about these models specifically, but I think more generally, random effects models, simulation studies have shown that they are fairly robust to departures from non-normality. That's for continuous responses. When you have binary data, there's often more of an issue. And then going back to an earlier question, this is a situation when you might want to then bring in mixtures of what's sort of a latent class structure to distinguish between latent subgroups that have different distributions, either on a continuous response or if you've got binary data to allow for sort of mover stayers, in other words, individuals who always have the same response, looking at longitudinal data over time. And those same approaches can be used for dyadic data.
A bit more technical, what estimation methods did you use in the second example? I apologize, can't recall.
Okay, so just a general answer, it was all MCMC methods. And so we used the JAGS software, so that was Gibbs sampling. Okay, thank you.
I think one more question. What advice would you give to someone who was looking to start working in this area?
Okay. Well, so I'll put the slides on my website. There are very many good introductory references, and I think it really helps that this area has grown out of applied disciplines, because it means that there are a lot of papers that explain things in very simple terms, where the focus is on the interpretation. All right? So I think there is definitely an easy way in, particularly to the simpler models, and I think it's also useful to have a good understanding of multi-level models. And then you can start to put the two together. But most of the papers I have cited there are applied papers, which I think are quite accessible.
And last question, I think, before we wrap this up. Could the potential substitution effect be masked if two types of parent-children classes exist, substitutors and and children that help both?
Okay. Yes, it could. And I think that's what's motivating our more recent research, where we actually try to model the correlation between financial and practical help as a function of covariates. And those characteristics and those covariates could allow for different patterns in different subgroups of the population. But you're absolutely right. When you just look at the correlation overall, that can indeed be masking effects. Yeah.
Thank you. I I think thank you very much is in order for Fiona. Much
Thank you very
appreciated.
much. Thank you.